A young woman went missing. In a panic, she sent voice messages asking for help. But no one could have imagined what was coming next. The body that was found, in a brutal state, shocked the whole town. Who's responsible for this tragedy? What secrets lie behind this story? Between revenge, secrets, and fears, the investigation is just getting started. Are you ready to find out what really happened to Vitória? Follow the most shocking case in Cajamar. The case of Vitória, a 17-year-old girl, gained widespread attention in late February 2025 when she mysteriously disappeared. On February 26th, after leaving work, Vitória was on her way home when she started noticing two men following her. She sent voice messages to a friend expressing her concern because she noticed one of the men was tailing her really closely. In her messages, Vitória described her fear and panic. She mentioned that the man was watching her and that she felt extremely vulnerable. She also mentioned a car with some men circling around nearby, which only made her feel more uneasy. As things got even more tense, she said she was heading to the bus stop, but after that, she couldn't keep in touch. The last time Vitória communicated with someone was when she talked about the suspicious car and how she felt like she was being followed. She seemed scared, but couldn't escape, since the bus stop was the closest place she could go. After that conversation, Vitória vanished without a trace. No calls were answered, and her phone stopped responding. Vitória's disappearance sparked a huge response from both her family and the local authorities. She had disappeared in a moment of fear and insecurity, which led to an intensification of the investigation. In the weeks that followed, the police began searching for clues that could explain what had happened. The police and family members immediately began searching and questioning possible witnesses. Security cameras in the area started to be reviewed, and statements from people who were on the street at the time began to be collected. The feeling was that something serious had happened, and the authorities were determined to find answers quickly. At the start of the investigation, the police didn't have many leads, but one important detail came to light. The suspicious car that Vitória mentioned was seen nearby. Additionally, witnesses said that the car seemed to be keeping an eye on Vitória, suggesting that she had been under surveillance before she disappeared. This led the authorities to focus on a possible connection with the suspects. Vitória's disappearance not only worried her family and friends, but also the entire local community. The voice messages she sent to her friend showed just how terrified and at risk she was. In a town like Cajamar, where people usually feel safer, the fact that something so violent had happened left everyone shocked and on high alert. Despite the investigative efforts, the authorities still didn't have clear answers about who could be behind her disappearance. The mystery deepened with each passing day, and anxiety took over everyone involved in the search for Vitória. The case was far from being solved, but the hope of finding her alive still fueled the search. Even though the investigation was making progress, Vitória's disappearance was raising more questions than answers. The authorities began to realize that the case might be more complicated than they initially thought. Something serious had happened, and everyone was waiting for more solid clues to uncover the truth. The search for Vitória began immediately after her disappearance, with the police using all available resources to try to find her. The first steps in the investigation included reviewing the security cameras in the area, and what was discovered proved to be crucial to the case's development. Security footage showed Vitória walking alone toward the bus stop, where she was last seen. Moreover, more witnesses came forward, providing information about what they saw that day. Some people reported noticing a suspicious car near Vitória's house, suggesting that she had been watched for a while. This was an important detail, as it indicated that Vitória wasn't just randomly followed, but rather had likely been monitored in a more deliberate way. Authorities began to gather all the information they could about what happened that night. The bus stop, where Vitória was last seen, became the focal point of the investigation. Her situation seemed more and more dire, as she had said in her voice messages that she couldn't run and was afraid for her life. The lack of options and the vulnerability she faced made it clear that Vitória was in a dangerous position. Additionally, a key detail came up during the investigation. Vitória's father, Carlos Alberto Souza, couldn't pick her up that night due to a car problem. This added to the family's desperation and increased the fear that something tragic might have occurred. The lack of immediate support and the absence of communication with the young woman made the search even harder. At this early stage, the police focused on the possible routes Vitória could have taken home. They reviewed security footage from surrounding streets, trying to map her path and identify any suspicious activity. However, the clues were few, and investigators started working with a range of possible theories. As the initial search continued, the behavior of the young woman before she vanished suggested she was afraid of something or someone. This indicated that her disappearance could be part of a larger plan, possibly involving revenge or something more personal. The police began exploring these possibilities as the investigation took shape. Pressure was mounting on the police as the community and Vitória's family demanded quick answers. Everyone hoped she would be found alive, but the worst-case scenario was starting to be considered, especially due to her sudden disappearance and the panic messages she had sent. The big question was whether Vitória had been kidnapped or if there was another motive behind her disappearance. The investigation was still in its early stages, and the answers weren't clear. But the sense that something very serious had happened was apparent to everyone involved. The mystery around Vitória's disappearance grew with each passing day. The police began considering the possibility that she had been kidnapped, and the search efforts increased, with the hope of finding her alive and catching those responsible for the crime as quickly as possible. After more than a week of intense searching, a chilling discovery was made. On March 5, 2025, Vitória's body was found in a rural area of Cajamar, in an advanced state of decomposition. The discovery of the body confirmed everyone's worst fears. Vitória was dead. The crime scene was shocking and brutal, and the community was devastated by the revelation. The body was found with clear signs of torture and extreme violence. Vitória's hair had been shaved. She had a deep wound in her throat, and she was naked, with her body partially dismembered. Her hands were bound, indicating that she had been controlled and forced during her captivity. In an attempt to avoid leaving any DNA traces, the killer had placed a plastic bag in her hands. The discovery of the body in an advanced state of decomposition suggested that the young woman had been dead for a few days. This raised new questions about the time and circumstances of her death. A preliminary autopsy indicated that Vitória's death may have occurred at a distant location, about 30 kilometers from where the body was found, near a reservoir. This suggested she had been transported to the crime scene after being killed. Investigators started piecing together the puzzle and analyzing the evidence found at the crime scene. In addition to the body, other personal items of Vitória were found, such as strands of her hair and belongings, indicating that she had been in a highly vulnerable state when she was killed. These findings helped support the theory that Vitória had been held captive before being murdered. Vitória's voice messages, sent shortly before she disappeared, began to be analyzed more closely. In the messages, she expressed a sense of panic and insecurity, reflecting the seriousness of the situation. Her fear was palpable, and the investigation revealed that she had been closely watched, possibly by someone who knew her well. With the discovery of the body, the police shifted, Their focus to identifying those responsible for the crime. The brutality of the murder made it clear that the people involved were extremely violent. And this wasn't just a simple kidnapping. The investigation now centered on uncovering the motivation behind this cruel act. Now that the body had been found, questions about what really happened to Vitória started to take shape. The most likely theory was that she had been held captive for 2 days before being killed. The authorities now had an important clue. Vitória's last phone signal had been registered in the area where the body was found, suggesting that she had been transported there after her death. Vitória's family, especially her father, suffered an indescribable pain. The search, which had seemed like a race against time, ended tragically, and the community of Cajamar was left facing a cruel and senseless crime. The loss of a young girl full of dreams and hopes was felt by everyone. With Vitória's body found, the investigation intensified in the search for answers. Who could commit such a heinous crime against a defenseless young woman? The hunt for justice was now the focus, and everyone was desperate to know the truth behind what really happened to Vitória. The investigation into Vitória's death began to take new turns when the forensic examination revealed that her death might have occurred at a location far from where her body was found. About 30 kilometers away, near a reservoir, was where Vitória's last phone signal had been recorded. This was a major breakthrough in the investigation. The conclusion that Vitória had been transported after her death raised new questions. The police believe she had been held captive for 2 days before being murdered. During that time, she must have endured suffering and violence, which made the search for justice even more painful. The fact that the body was found so far away showed that the criminals had some kind of plan. They didn't just commit the murder, they also tried to hide the evidence, which showed how cold and brutal the act was. This suggests that the murder was premeditated. The analysis of the voice messages Vitória sent was also crucial in understanding the severity of the situation. She was terrified and clearly aware of the danger she was in. The combination of witness accounts and Vitória's messages made it clear that she had been watched before disappearing. This points to a deeper connection between the victim and the criminals. Moreover, the fact that the suspicious car was seen near Vitória's house reinforces the theory that she had been under surveillance before being kidnapped. The authorities started investigating the suspect's connections to understand how everything fit together. The first names to come up as suspects were Vitória's ex-boyfriend and her current fling. The investigation into Vitória's case started focusing on 2 main lines of inquiry: femicide or revenge. The 2 main suspects from the start were Gustavo, Henrique Lira, Vitória's ex, and Gustavo Vinicius, her current fling. The first, Gustavo Henrique Lira, voluntarily came to the police and, after being questioned, was ruled out as a suspect. However, the name of Gustavo Vinicius remained central to the investigation. Vitória's relationship with Gustavo Vinicius seemed troubled. Witness accounts indicated that their relationship could have been toxic, with episodes of fights and disagreements. The fact that Vitória tried to contact him the night she disappeared raised even more suspicions about his involvement in the case. Furthermore, the fact that he wasn't seen showing any concern about her disappearance raised even more red flags. The police also began investigating other possible suspects, like the 2 men seen following Vitória to the bus stop, as she mentioned in her voice messages. These men, whose identities were still being investigated, were added to the list of potential suspects. Additionally, another name that came up was Michael Antonio Salas dos Santos, the owner of a suspicious car that had been seen near the bus stop and Vitória's house. The involvement of other people in the crime became a possibility as new details emerged. Daniel Lucas Pereira, for example, was identified as another person who needed to be investigated. the police found out that Daniel had a connection to Gustavo Vinicius, which brought up the possibility that jealousy or personal disputes could be behind Vitoria's murder. During a search of Daniel's house, the police found evidence linking him to the case, although it wasn't possible to confirm his involvement with certainty at that time. These new elements led the police to expand their investigation and dig deeper into the connections between the suspects. The combination of evidence found during the investigation and witness accounts made the authorities start building a scenario where the victim was being watched and controlled by a network of people with personal motives. The investigation now wasn't just focused on the two men seen following Vitória, but also on a wider network of suspects. The interactions between the suspects and the possibility of personal involvement among them made it clear that Vitória's murder could have more complex motives. While the police continued examining every detail, the community became more involved in the case, with many anxiously waiting for the identification of those responsible. Vitória's ex-boyfriend and her fling were in the spotlight, but the truth was that the investigation was still ongoing and more clues could emerge at any moment. The mystery of who really committed this brutal crime remained unsolved, but the pressure on the suspects was mounting. They needed to give plausible explanations for their actions that night. The search for the truth continued, and the police were determined to bring the responsible parties to justice, so that Vitória's tragedy could be resolved and the young woman could get the justice she deserved. As the investigation into Vitória's murder advanced, new names started to appear as potential suspects. One of the most important names was Michael Antonio Salles dos Santos, the owner of the suspicious car seen near where Vitória disappeared. The police started investigating the movements of this car and its connection to the other suspects. But no conclusive evidence was found to directly link Michael to the crime. Another name that came up was Daniel Lucas Pereira, who was also investigated by the police. Daniel, whose house was searched with a warrant, was being associated with the case due to a possible romantic involvement with Gustavo Vinicius, Vitória's fling. This link increased suspicions of jealousy and a toxic relationship between those involved, which could have motivated the crime. The police also found evidence of communication between Daniel and Gustavo Vinicius, which further deepened the connection between these two suspects. These new names indicated that Vitória's murder could have been caused by a complex web of personal relationships, rather than just one person. The involvement of different individuals and their connections with the victim and with each other suggested that the motive for the crime could be deeper, involving jealousy, relationship disputes, or even revenge. The investigation also focused on the networks of communication and messages exchanged between the suspects before and after Vitória's disappearance. This investigation revealed important details about the relationships between those involved, and the police became more convinced that the crime was premeditated and involved more than one person. The combination of physical evidence, like Michael's car and the findings at Daniel's house, helped reinforce this theory. Meanwhile, Vitória's family continued to wait for answers, unsure of how the involvement of these people could have led to such a tragedy. The investigation was still ongoing, but those involved in Vitória's death needed to be held accountable. The family's main goal now was to ensure that Vitória's memory was preserved and that the guilty parties would pay for their actions. As the investigation continued, many people were waiting for answers. Vitória's case generated a movement of support for her family, and many were calling for justice on social media and in the streets of Cajamar. The town, now marked by this brutal crime, was coming together in search of answers to understand what led to this young woman's death and who was responsible. The impact of Vitória's tragedy went beyond the family's pain, affecting the entire community. Many were demanding more security and more effective public policies to prevent crimes like this from happening again. The search for justice was also linked to the fight for better safety conditions in the city, so that other families wouldn't have to endure the same suffering. The investigation remained confidential, but authorities were working tirelessly to solve the case. Many were eagerly waiting for the moment when the responsible parties would be identified and brought to justice. Vitoria's story and her tragic death served as a reminder that we must fight for justice, so that crimes like this are not left unpunished. The fight for the truth and justice for Vitória continues. The community, her family, and everyone following the case hope that soon the answers will be found and the young woman will get the justice she deserves.